Welcome back to Catholic Curious, the podcast where we address misconceptions and curiosities about being Catholic. I'm Karen.
I'm Kirsten.
And today we're going to talk about the misconception, I can't be Catholic if I believe in science.
That's right. The opposition of faith and reason or faith and science.
Now, this was a really big deal when I was growing up, right? Really big deal in my Christian tradition that wasn't Catholic, which was we need to be a little suspicious about science. And I think, honestly, as a young Christian, I was always just a little confused and conflicted because, yeah, let's use science for medicine and technology and things to make our human life better, but let's not believe science when it makes us afraid, basically, right?
Oh, yeah, I hadn't thought about it that way. Makes us doubt what we're reading in the Bible.
Yes, and
Perhaps
of course
there's that conflict.
Yes, I think
times.
that's absolutely a conflict for a lot of people, particularly Genesis is a place that a lot of people point to, whereas the scientific record would age the world and humanity and the development of all of creation very differently than 7 days.
Yes. Yeah.
Like millions of years.
Yeah.
Billions of years.
Yeah. A huge difference.
Yeah. And so that's a conflict for folks. And if that's a conflict for you, you've tuned into the right place, actually. Actually, you should just become Catholic because it won't be a conflict anymore.
Yeah, it won't be a conflict.
It's one of the reliefs of being
Easy.
Catholic for
There
me.
we
Yeah,
go.
there you go.
There
so
we
tell
go.
us more about that, Kirsten.
The conflict?
Or just, why it's not a conflict.
Well, it's not a conflict per se, in that in the Catholic faith, when it comes to the Bible, the Catholic Church believes that everything is true in the Bible, but it may be truth it depends on how books of the Bible, what was the point of the book of the Bible.
It might not be a factual truth.
It may have happened.
Yes. And
but it's all true. It's all true.
Even things that happened and are accurately, factually depicted in the Bible are only there because of the greater truth that they point to.
Right.
So if you talk about, let's start with the Gospels, stories of Jesus's life.
Right.
Most people, historians, atheists even, don't really question that the Gospels have veracity in terms of, well, Jesus went to Jerusalem and he preached to these people and, you know, Jesus is widely regarded as a historic figure and there's no reason for anyone to question the historical facts of his life. But the book of John says, this is only just a little bit. The last line of the book of John says, it is one of my favorites. If everything could be written, I'm going to have to look it up. If everything else was written down, there wouldn't be enough libraries in the world to hold everything about Jesus. So that's our pointing to going, okay, well then the stuff that is here for a specific reason.
Right. And if you're thinking of like Genesis, like the creation story, I want you to think, was Genesis written to be a science book?
No, it was not
written to be a science book. It was to tell us about creation. It was to tell us about God, who God is, what God is, the purpose of creation. And even if it were written as a science book, the people back then would not have understood the science.
That's true. And, you know, science actually does not contradict the order of Genesis, right? So interestingly enough, anything that's in the Bible, to my knowledge, has ultimately been only confirmed through science. And what I mean by that is not the 24-hour day, but that first would have come light, and then the waters would have separated, and then the fish would have been there first, and then and that's not even a concept that anybody, like, science shows us that this is how evolution would have happened. That's not even a concept 2,000 years ago people would have had in any way, shape, or form. Right? They wouldn't have thought, oh, smaller beings and larger beings, but that's what they were manifesting or understanding at the time.
Well, and I was thinking back to my parents were pretty fundamentalist about the creation story, and it has to be
Mm-hmm.
it has to be 6 days, it has to be this, it has to be that. And I remember when the Big Bang Theory came out,
Uh-huh.
and my dad was like, "The Big Bang Theory, that's not right. That's not what the Bible says."
Seems like
But-
that is actually what the Bible says.
Exactly. But I think it was dismissed outright without actually thinking through what that was. I mean, that's exactly how it is, right?
Yeah.
Light.
Let there be light.
Let there be light.
Boom.
And not only that is, from what I understand now, I'm not a scientist. How I understand it is the way the Big Bang Theory works is that there are shifts in time,
Mm-hmm.
and you have almost this relative time. You just have these changes of time. So time
I think the
is not-
physicists just haven't gotten far enough yet.
I just haven't gotten far enough.
I really do think so. It's absolutely something that changed in my life. This tension between science and faith was always there for me until I met my husband, who had grown up Catholic. He is very into the stars and space. And that's one of those areas for me that is kind of intimidating. And we always joke around, like, he legit believes that there are aliens out there, other life on other planets. And I'm like, that contradicts my theological understanding. But my husband would say, I'm like, what about Jesus dying for us? He's like, well, then Jesus died for them too. But what my husband, who's always very fascinated by the physicists, by the astronomers, the reason he is fascinated by them is because he believes they are on the forefront of what God is revealing to us now. And that is such a beautiful thing in his estimation. And yeah, no Christian would say the story's done.
That's true. Yeah.
No Christian would say, yes, we have the Bible and that's it, and God hasn't revealed anything to us since then. Even the most fundamental folks wouldn't say that. They would all say, yes, we should use our reason, we should learn more, we should have knowledge, those kind of things. And so that's where my opinion really shifted, and it was so freeing to be like, oh, you mean I can believe that the physicists aren't against us, but that God's just showing them something. And then if God shows them something that seems to contradict what we feel like we know about God's creation, then it's time for us to readjust, to reframe what we know. That takes me back to, and I see you have written down there, Galileo, right? So Galileo, church doesn't have this great history with the story of Galileo, right?
Yeah.
You want to talk about that a little bit? Okay.
I would just say with Galileo, it's very easy for knee-jerk reactions. I think there's a little more nuance involved. It wasn't that he just said this thing and the church was like, no. They were just asking him to wait a bit so there could be a little more testing, a little more. And this was also, I believe, during some of the Protestant Reformation, or before, when there was a lot of conflict between the church and the state and other institutions. And Galileo had a strong disdain for the Pope at the time and was ridiculing him. And so, we're just used to making fun of our leaders on a day-to-day, on the daily. But back then, your leaders, your authorities had a little more, can't think of the word.
So we got the opportunity to go to the Galileo Museum, and what Kirsten said is my understanding of what it was actually true, is that it was not that the church disagreed with what Galileo was finding. It was more a concern that the church had that the people couldn't handle that, and that it would be a detriment to the faith of the people to have that kind of dramatic change in worldview happen that quickly. Now that may sound like an excuse to a certain extent, but it was more about Galileo wanted to usurp the authority and the hierarchy rather than we don't believe what you're saying is true.
Yeah.
The other thing that stuck out to me when we visited the Galileo Museum is that science back in that day was basically like a dog and pony show. A lot of the early scientific discoveries were entertainment for rich people in their palaces, because they're the ones who could afford to have the luxury to do science. And then the scientific thing, so in that museum there's all these like contraptions and stuff, and they would show gravity, and they would show like sparks and things that to us today seem stupid. Not stupid, but they just everyday kind of stuff. Your kid's toy can show a spark, but back then that was like this huge deal. And they would basically, scientists would go around and do these like dog and pony shows for rich people in their parlors, and they would show all this stuff. So Galileo, being a scientist, didn't have the same kind of status that science has now,
right,
for us. The seriousness of it, I guess you might say. It was in very early stages, and people didn't really take it in the same way that we would take it today. That really stuck out to me.
Right, and of course Galileo was drawn and quartered, and I'm kidding.
Yeah, I was going to say that. What? I don't remember that part.
The harshest part was that he had to be under house arrest in his very fancy villa.
Yeah.
Not to say that we're for house arrest, but I just kind of want to diminish some of what maybe just put in perspective. And sometimes we don't have perspective of cultural influences, of just other things that are going on at the time, and how other people would see that kind of thing at the time. It's just very easy for us in our quick information age, how we don't have a lot of respect for most of our world leaders, and often for church leaders. Kind of a different
That is true.
space.
That is true. And I think that Galileo gets sort of like held up then as this like person who looks very different in the 21st century than he would have looked then. Not to say that what he was doing wasn't serious and important work. I just think that the story has been twisted a little bit to serve modern needs. Modern needs of rejecting or placing a barrier between faith and science.
Right.
And there's so many other things we could go into about. What I wanted to look up and I didn't have a chance to look up is, when did this whole idea come about that science and faith weren't compatible?
A key step of development of science was the invention of the university in the Middle Ages. So the Middle Ages is where, and I mean, we sometimes forget about this, it was the monks.
Yeah, it was.
They were developing.
It was the church that developed science.
About science and nature.
Yeah.
Some key scientists in their fields. Gregor Mendel, genetics. He was an Augustinian friar in the 1800s. George Lemaitre, he was a Belgian priest. He proposed the Big Bang Theory. Copernicus came through the church system. Louis Pasteur, the French chemist and microbiologist. He developed pasteurization and vaccines for rabies and anthrax. Descartes developed Cartesian geometry. Blaise Pascal was a mathematician and physicist. The list goes on and on, really. If you would just Google key Catholic scientists and their fields, like, it just goes on and on, from the pediatrician who found the chromosomal cause of Down syndrome to the person who invented, the Marconi, the radio.
Yeah.
So
he's buried. I saw where he is buried too.
Yeah.
They're all buried in a cathedral over there in Florence.
Jesuit priests were very involved in developing the method for earthquakes, the Richter scale.
So some people would say, oh, well, that's just because that's where all the education was back then, and they didn't really do this for the glory of God. What would you say to people like that?
Is that what they've said? I mean, people say that, but I just think it's very common for us to repeat phrases that we hear.
I've heard people kind of argue, I think I've heard people argue, well, they were just given the opportunity because they were a monk, not really doing it as a part of their religious practice or their part of growing closer to God. And that's the Catholic view, is that science reveals God to us in ways we would never have imagined before. The Catechism says that science is the study of God's creation, that science and reason are complementary paths to truth, not contradictory paths to truth, and that science reveals God to us in ways we never imagined, which I think is beautiful.
It is.
And so much easier to live in that reality than I must be in tension over science.
That's right.
So all these people who pushed forward scientific method and scientific understanding, they were all trying to get to know God better.
That's right.
Yeah.
I would say that too. I guess people would have to see, are there writings about why? Are there writings from people about why they're doing the research and the study?
Well, some of it probably has to do with like money being available, and the church has to, if they're going to put money towards it, that means they believe it's an important priority, right? Whether it's healing human diseases, or helping human life be better, or whether it's understanding the stars. And I was also thinking of the Vatican observatories that my family likes to talk about a lot. Those are things that are still going on today.
Yeah.
And as a mother who has a child who is very science focused, very space focused, very physics focused, I am really grateful that he's my Catholic child, not my way I grew up child. Because I think growing up, he would have experienced a lot of what you're interested in doesn't glorify God. Whereas opposed to the world he's grown up in, it's everything you're interested glorifies God. Every interest you have in space, every interest you have in figuring out how things work, all of that was part of God's given blessing or joy for you. And that brings me a lot of peace. I know that he will go off to university and face opposition to his faith, just because that's the way our world is right now. But I feel like he's very solid in understanding that there is no opposition between discovering things anew. And it's one of the other things I appreciate about like popes, modern popes, whether it's Francis or Leo. One of the lines of communication that I've read a lot more, and maybe I just wasn't as tuned into it before, maybe it's always been there, but it's definitely been there with Francis and Leo, which is, as the Catholic Church, we are responsible for responding to this age and this human situation that we are placed in now. Because this age and this human situation is what God called us to, because that's where we are. And it is very different than when Galileo was sitting there making his arguments, or the early scientists were just trying to figure out how, was it beans, green beans? Is that how was that the
peas.
Genetics? Peas. How peas would pass on their traits.
Right.
We are in a very different world, and the church, the Catholic Church, is constantly reevaluating is not quite the right word. Reframing and asking God, okay, now you've thrown this at us, like AI. Right. Now we've got AI, God. What part of that, God's allowed AI to happen, so what part of that do you want us to use? How are we supposed to respond to it? Who are we supposed to be within it? All of those things.
That's a really good point, because I'm thinking of, there are technologies that are really great for advancement, but humans are also capable of creating things through science that may not be for the best.
Absolutely.
And sometimes things look really great.
Yes.
Initially, but
then they really are not. Like DDT. That looked DDT. Right. Do you know DDT, everybody? It was a pesticide, right? It looked like it was great because we're going to make more food. Because we're not going to have these bugs, or whatever. And then DDT caused birth defects, and nearly it made the eagles go extinct. All these horrible things. Yes. So the church, being aware of the balance of that, is always like, okay, that's great, but and maybe that goes back to how they responded to Galileo. Okay, that's great, but let's pause for a moment and let's evaluate and ask God what this is about, because clearly DDT should not have happened.
Right. Well, and I'm going to bring up something very controversial, and if this is you, I just trying to throw some caution there. But IVF.
Yeah, IVF is
you know, yes, we have this technology, we have this ability to essentially create humans outside of the way we would normally create humans. What are the moral implications for that? And, you know, why would there be opposition? It's such a, I mean, we're all
creating babies.
We're creating life. What could be some problems there? So I think the church is also really good about, it's not just progress. What kind of progress are we talking about? Is it really progress?
Yeah.
And the church is going to be the one to want to talk about those kinds of things.
Yeah, and look at it in a global sense too. I'm thinking, I just read one of the papal letters about community within the global sense. So the church then, the Catholic Church, is global enough, large enough to be saying, okay, now we live in a globalized world. Now we have the internet. Now we have AI. Who should we be within that? With everything we know to be solid and true about God, who should we be within that as we relate to people across the world, which 10 years ago, 20 years ago, we would not have even had any interaction with? Which for me is also another reason why I have grown to really appreciate the global church, being a part of a global church, because it's very easy to get really tied up in just your singular focus of the day-to-day life that you live, or the country that you live in, or
Absolutely.
just the culture that you're a part of, and that's only one small slice. All Christians would say Jesus came for everyone, but not all Christians really have that direct experience with what it really means to live halfway around the world, with a different set of cultural expectations and a different set of things that are just going to happen in your life.
That's right. So,
science good.
Science good. The church is good. We can believe in science. We can study as scientists.
Yeah, it reminds me, I had this friend a long time ago. He is not Catholic. They're a beautiful, wonderful Christian family. I love them so much. He and I like to talk. And one day he came over to my house and he said, well, I'm just going to have to start my own church, which I thought was kind of funny. They go to a lot of non-denominational churches. And I was like, what's that about? And he started going in. I think he'd been to church and people had started like questioning his science. And he's like, it just doesn't make any sense to me that science, you know, isn't something that we should appreciate. And I was like, you should become Catholic.
So, you don't need to start your own church.
Don't start your own church. Just go back to the beginning. Just understand that this is all great. And again, I would take it back to, it's something that brings me joy because it's something I don't have to worry about anymore.
Well,
I don't have to be like, oh, we're going to the moon. I should be afraid. It's more like, oh, we're going to the moon. Yay. What is God doing here?
And I just feel like that that tension isn't there between the science and God. You know, when you're being that I'm Catholic now, but growing up, it was always like, you know, I had to like, what am I learning in science? Did they talk about evolution? Is that, how does, you know,
do I need to feel upset about that?
Yeah, is my faith threatened?
Do I need to just answer the right questions, but then know that I don't really believe that? Yeah.
So, anyway.
I think that's all we have for today. If you have any questions for us, you can certainly email us at imcatholiccurious@gmail.com, and we hope to hear from you soon.
Bye.
Bye.